The Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and your local cable provider presents Cable Reports. Join us now as Cable Reports brings you up to date on current issues facing the Commonwealth through discussions with your local legislators and other policymakers from across Virginia.
From the General Assembly and the City of Richmond, I'm Woody Evans for Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast, connecting Virginians to their government. We're very fortunate to have two members of the House of Delegates. Delegate Ben Cline, good to see you, sir.
Thank you, Woody. Good to be here.
Delegate Steve Landis, wonderful that you are here.
Woody, thanks for having us again.
The economy is still first and foremost amongst most Virginians. Tell us about how things are going on in that regard in your district and what we need to do statewide to create a new Virginia economy.
Well, I think in the Shenandoah Valley and the Piedmont regions that I represent, things are going okay. They're not as strong as they have been historically, and that's true across the Commonwealth of Virginia. We are trying to do what we can here to provide common sense incentives and programs, but we've got a lot more to do. We've got to really move away from dependence on federal spending and diversify the economy, whether it's Northern Virginia, Hampton Roads, or the Shenandoah Valley, Piedmont regions.
And Delegate Cline, I think the latest numbers suggest that unfortunately the Commonwealth is 48th in growth now, and I believe 13 out of the top 20 employers are government related. How do we change that picture?
That's right. The Commonwealth needs to diversify its economy, focus less on government contracts from the federal government, because those are not going to be as plentiful as they have been. As the federal government seeks to get a handle on its budget, we're going to have to make sure that our economy is ready to stand independent of any federal largesse. So we need to address that, but we also need to address the problems at home. Folks are hurting. Whether it's energy costs or the costs of food or costs of daily living, folks are getting squeezed, and we need to help them where we can.
So despite reports that there's little or no inflation, there really is a lot of it going on.
In some specific areas, there definitely is some price inflation, and families definitely need relief if we can get it to them.
Now, you're the Vice Chair of Finance, and obviously that's one of the big money committees. Talk to us about some of the things going on and some of the issues you are addressing on finance.
Well, I'm the Vice Chair of Finance, and Steve is the Vice Chair of Appropriations. So Finance Committee deals with revenues that come into the Commonwealth, and the Appropriations Committee deals with how they are spent. So setting tax policy is an important role of the General Assembly. We are the stewards of the taxpayer dollars, the guardians of the Treasury, so to speak, and we take our responsibility very seriously. Now, when it comes to certain taxes, some taxes have a harder hitting impact on families at risk. So when it comes to taxes on things like food, we try and minimize that. I've put in a bill to eliminate the state tax on food because everybody has to buy food, and when you're on a low income, that's an important staple that you should be able to afford, and taxing that should not be a priority. But when it comes to once the revenues are in, and revenues have been rebounding, Delegate Landis and the Appropriations Committee sees fit how to allocate it.
So do we really have a surplus, as was earlier reported, or is it just unanticipated revenues, as someone suggested?
I would describe it as a revenue surplus, and that was just our estimates were, we tend to be conservative in our revenue estimates. That's always a better policy. And actually some areas did perform better than we expected. And in non-withholding, especially the people that are fairly well-to-do, did better, and obviously the state benefited from their payment of taxes. The challenge, though, is I think going forward, in December things were pretty flat. January doesn't look like it's been much better, so the first part of February we'll find out kind of where we are revenue-wise, and that will impact how much we are able to spend based on the governor's budget.
Talk to us a little bit about the budget pie. Where did those revenues come from, generally speaking?
Well, as Ben knows, the revenues come from a number of sources, but the major ones are the income tax, the sales tax we all pay, non-withholding and withholding are the income tax portions, corporate tax, then we get lottery proceeds and revenues, and then various other areas like recordation, which is the sale of properties, real estate. So those are our main sources of revenue for the state.
You have a comment about that?
Well, we are too dependent on the income tax, and in the past few years, I think there's been a shift more towards an emphasis on the sales tax. We've had sales tax increase in 2004 and again in 2013. I would like to see a reduction in the income tax as a result, because that puts more emphasis on the consumer to decide when and how they want to make purchases that have taxes on them, rather than simply taxing income regardless of what activity the taxpayer performs.
So I believe you have a bill to reduce the individual income tax rate in the Commonwealth?
I do. I do have a bill to reduce the income tax rate, but it's paired with another one because I think there's too much emphasis on tax credits and special tax benefits for specific groups, but they, depending on their performance, all have expiration dates. I introduced legislation about 5 years ago to sunset all future and new tax credits after 6 years. And what I've done is proposed that when a tax credit sunsets, that savings not be go to the bottom line to be spent, that it go to the actual income tax payer through a reduced rate.
Do you see a need to overhaul the plethora of tax credits that currently exist?
I do. We have some that are very old and some, quite frankly, outdated. Some that were put in place that never performed as well as they had been anticipated to perform. That's why we need to reconsider tax credits every few years. And they're not necessarily a bad thing. If you're trying to incentivize certain behavior, then they can be helpful. The mortgage tax deduction, for example, is something that helps lots of families and help them afford homes. But other tax credits we need to review and quite frankly, potentially sunset.
Do we have the data available in order to do a comprehensive review at this point?
I think the Finance Committee has really been looking closely, and obviously we work with them because it has an impact on the budget. I mean, if you don't have the revenues and through a tax credit, then obviously there are fewer resources you can use for prioritization within the budget. But as Ben said, some of those are good things. I think the sunset reform is really good, so it makes us look at those. We have a tax preference commission or joint committee that actually I created through a recommendation from JLARC through legislation a few years ago. They've gotten to a slow start, I would say, though, and I'm hoping that they, along with the finance committees, both on the Senate and the House side, will be able to look at these things on a more regular basis. And I think the Finance Committee really wants to take the lead on that, and that's where it should be.
Let's talk a little bit about your responsibilities as chair of the Education Committee. And can you outline what the agenda of your committee currently is?
Well, we have a number of initiatives, and I'm very proud that the House of Delegates has really taken the lead in the last few years in looking at education reform. We have a number of bills that we're trying to move through, and actually have already gone through the committee, and now we're in appropriations because of a potential fiscal impact. One is a piece of legislation that Delegate Dickey Bill has related to setting up a virtual school for all Virginia children to be able to have access, whether they're homeschoolers or have special needs and are at home. We have a education savings account piece of legislation that Delegate LaRock has that would basically allow parents, again, additional flexibility to if they've got a child that's in a difficult school situation or a challenge school, an additional option of either private school or another public school. So that's moving out. We have also, which wasn't in the Education Committee, but I think an important reform that the Education Committee would get a chance to look at if the people adopt it, and that is the referendum on charter schools. We have a very restrictive charter school statute because the Constitution gives that sole authority to grant charter schools to local school boards. Most local school boards do a great job, but we only have 9 charter schools in Virginia, and the District of Columbia, which you don't always want to be compared to, but they're much more progressive. And even the President of the United States has supported this, so it's not really a partisan issue. They have 36 or 38. So we would like to have the constitutional amendment, have the voters approve that hopefully, and have that come out of the General Assembly session so that we could come back then and maybe look at a more flexible system that would allow more charter schools across the Commonwealth.
Lots of talk this session and in past sessions about the necessity to be more transparent. And I believe you've been involved in an initiative this year in that regard.
Well, I have been pushing transparency for several years. I've helped to put the budget on the internet through legislation we passed back in 2000, I believe it was 2009, and put it in a user-friendly format so you can really see where all the dollars are going. Also, last year we started, and this year we continued, making the budget available for 48 hours before it's voted on, so that folks back home and quite frankly many of my colleagues can read the budget and make sure they know what's in it when we vote on it. This year I've got a bill in to make sure that all legislation gets a consideration by a committee or a subcommittee. In Washington, which takes this abuse to the extreme, you introduce a bill and it's never heard again, or never heard, period. Down here, we try and hear most bills. Some bills don't make it to consideration. This legislation would require that they get a hearing and a vote in a subcommittee or a full committee.
And there were a couple of rules, I think, that the Speaker, the House adopted at the request of the Speaker at the beginning of the session.
Right, that was the 48-hour consideration.
Right.
That was legislation I had last year that the Speaker put into place through the rules this year. And there's also language in the rules change that would ensure that the conference report on the budget, that agreement with the Senate, indicate whether there's anything new in there that was put in at the last minute, or anything that's funding for what's called a non-state agency or a private group.
I guess that's a very important consideration, so that members have an opportunity to actually know what they're voting on in terms of a conference report.
That's a great reform, and more importantly, those of us that are involved in the budget process, we know the ins and outs. But as Ben said, not all members. We only have 22 members on the Appropriations Committee. Those of us that are on the budget conference, that's only 12 people that are making the final decision on a recommendation that members get to either agree to or not, and that's why that transparency is so important. It puts more pressure on us to get our job done in a timely manner, but that's a good thing. A deadline never hurts.
Now, what about some of the things that the governor talked about in the State of the Commonwealth address in terms of increasing funding in education across the board?
Woody, I think there's support for additional funding for education, but we always somewhat differ with the administration on where those dollars are going. What we're looking to do is see if we can come up with a way, and trying to see, and we've heard from our colleagues, to provide more flexibility for local schools, not to kind of have those dollars tied directly so much that they don't have flexibility. I think we agree with the additional dollars, but may have a little bit of a different approach in how we give them back to localities. People have to remember that the state provides about 50% of the funding, and then the localities have to come up and match those dollars. So it's not just, when you talk about a pay raise for teachers,
right,
we're only providing half of that. So if you say 2%, we're only providing literally 1% of that 2% pay raise, because they have to come up with the additional dollars. And some localities can afford that better than others.
And Delegate Cline, I know you're a member of the Conservative Caucus. Talk to us about its goals and objectives this session.
Well, it's been a privilege to chair the caucus for the past, I believe, about 6 years, and Steve is a member, and many members from the Valley and Southwest Virginia participate. We meet weekly and have an agenda that we put out at the beginning of the session, bills we want to focus on, and it's a very organic process where members come in and want to participate, put forward their ideas, have them considered by the caucus and made part of the agenda so that we can pursue a conservative agenda. Most of the time it lines up with the leadership in the House and Senate, but sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes the House and Senate are focused on broader issues whereas the Conservative Caucus wants to focus on issues related to things like property rights or life or tax reductions, any number of issues that may not be getting the full consideration we want.
Now, you also serve on courts of justice and commerce and labor. There's some kind of interesting, I believe they're nonpartisan matters as a result of new technologies, and that's drones. So I think the chairman of Commerce and Labor has a bill dealing with drones in localities, and the chairman of Courts of Justice has a bill dealing with those kind of creepy things that, that drones can do. Talk to us about both of those.
He does, and the chairman of Commerce and Labor put in a bill saying that no locality can create regulations regarding drones because you don't want a patchwork of regulations regarding this new burgeoning industry in the Commonwealth. When it comes to private use of drones, we want to encourage that development because it helps lower costs for business, help individuals, whether it's through job creation or through making life better, whether Amazon can deliver to your door or not. Who knows what's going to happen. But Virginia is a leader now in drone technology with a participation through Virginia Tech in one of the federal programs there for drone study. But and I support the Chairman Kilgore's bill, but also Chairman Albo put in a bill because drones, just like any technology, can be abused, and we want to make sure that drones aren't hovering outside your window when you're getting ready in the morning or hovering over your pool when your kids are out playing. There are a lot of potential abuses there, so making sure that this technology is used for proper purposes and not misused is a critical goal that I support as well.
Now, you mentioned Representative Bell's virtual classroom initiative. That's another example of taking advantage of new technologies, is it not, to deliver educational content?
Sure. Woody, we actually have a pilot that the Department of Education is working on now, but what his concept is to offer, where possible, any student could access their curriculum for elementary or middle or high school while they're in their home. And if you've got broadband access to the internet, it's very easy to access classes and content. Now, we're trying to figure out kind of the balance, because there are certain times when it makes sense based on the course you're taking where you have access to talk to a teacher. And actually the technology's there between Skype and all these other things where you can actually talk face to face even though you're in somebody's, in your home or elsewhere other than a school. And that's what we're talking about. That's the direction we're really trying to head.
Now, you've talked in the past about having to make tough choices in terms of K through 12 education. What are some of those tough choices that we're going to have to make?
Well, some of the tough choices, I think, are we have a lot of what we call categorical spending in public education. That is special projects. They are probably great ideas, but our core responsibility is fund our standards of quality and our core responsibilities, and that is putting dollars in the classroom. We've been very fortunate the last number of years with the leadership of the House of Delegates to move from 63% to 65, over 65% funding going directly to the teacher and to the school for classroom instruction, because that's where the rubber meets the road. But that also means sometimes we have to say these extras They may be good. Those programs may show even some benefit, but if they're not statewide and they're not serving all the kids across the state, then we sometimes have to make the tough choice and say we'd rather put the dollars and invest the dollars in the classroom and have that spread across the Commonwealth of Virginia, not to kind of cherry pick or have one program in one part of the state and not another part of the state.
Airbnb is another issue that's before the General Assembly. Talk to us about that and whether that affects your constituents or not.
Well, tourism is a big, important part of the valley. So new technologies like Airbnb, which is where you can open your home as kind of a private B&B, put yourself out there on the internet, and people can arrange to stay at your house on their way through for tourism purposes or whatever. Now with that, if you're going to make yourself available as a business, there come certain responsibilities. You have to make sure that it meets health codes, for example. So making sure that just like a regular B&B, you're examined every year, once a year, for health purposes. Making sure that through the process you comply with the various rules and regulations for brick and mortar B&Bs that are open year round. That's an important thing. So there's a bill moving through to do that. Sensible regulation is appropriate. You try and keep it to a minimum because you don't want to hurt new technology, but at the same time, you want to make sure that it's done responsibly.
Somewhat akin to the debate last year over Uber and Lyft, the need to balance the interests of the incumbent against the new entrant.
That's exactly right, Woody. And actually, they're great concepts because you're allowing individuals to be entrepreneurs and really have their own business. But the rub, as Ben said, is trying to make sure that there's a level playing field with the folks that are already in those businesses providing those services, and at the same time allow these new technologies to be utilized for these entrepreneurs that want to provide a service to the individual citizen. But we have to make sure that they're following certain safety standards, and as Ben mentioned with the Airbnb, health codes and the like, because that's to protect the public and to make sure, again, there's that level playing field.
Do you think parents, teachers, and students have a better level of comfort when it comes to the standards of learning and the reforms that have occurred?
I think they do. I mean, the reduction of tests has been very helpful. We're still working on that process. It gets a little tougher when you get to high school and trying to find alternative assessments. We're looking at a whole new model of what high school will look like in the high school experience related to apprenticeships and internships and mentorships. But then we have to figure out how do you assess that and the progress that students are making, whether they're in career and technical or they're going on a higher education track, and what that mix is going to look like. But the reduction of the SOL tests has met with, I think, great success. And we want to make sure there's accountability there too. Even though we're reducing the number of tests, we still want to make sure our students are achieving and to make sure that they're well prepared so when they get out of high school, they're ready to go to work or be well prepared to go to college.
Delegate Cline, have you heard anything from your constituents about school discipline issues K through 12 and in our high schools, especially in terms of the use of school resource officers?
Well, that is an issue. You try and encourage the use of school resource officers, with the Sheriff's Department in the schools, because not only do you want that communication between the students and the Sheriff's Office, a friendly face, so to speak, someone that they can trust to go to with problems, but you also want to ensure safety in the schools. Now, there's been a problem with too much being put on the school resource officer. They are not there to enforce local school rules. They're there to enforce the law. So when they see a violation of the law, they need to step in, but they shouldn't be asked to help with the buses or things like that to make sure that the school runs right, because that's not their job. So we want to use them efficiently, but effectively as well.
And of course, there's been some concerns about the mandatory referrals that result in juvenile court for some of our youngsters as well.
That is, and that goes back to what you were just discussing with Ben. Actually, Delegate Jennifer McClellan's got a bill that we passed out of the House Education Committee that basically will make it clear that there responsibility is to deal with the law and making sure that individuals on school grounds are following the state statutes, whether it's an issue of violence or what it might be, and that the school officials enforce disciplinary policies. And that will help reduce the number of situations that are kind of borderline violation of state statutes or the criminal code or whatever it might be, and disciplinary measures that the schools need to take, because law enforcement officers have a lot to do.
Back to economic development, especially Go Virginia and the regional approach. How important a concept is that?
I think it's going to be very important. I think we'll see legislation coming out this session that Delegate Kirk Cox has, and I think Senator Tommy Norman on the Senate side, and others. But it'll set up a framework. It's not going to be the end-all and be-all, but it will allow, I think, more flexibility for regions to work and collaborate together for economic development projects. It'll allow regions in one part of the state and another part of the state to really collaborate where they've got sectors that are similar, where they can promote that benefit. For instance, in the Valley, it may be an opportunity to do something with folks in the Port region that benefits both the Valley and the Port. So that'll provide a great opportunity.
And of course, we have to talk about our veterans. Virginia values veterans, and that's a program which marries veterans who want employment up with private employers. How important is that?
It's so important, and we have such high numbers of veterans in the Valley and in Southwest Virginia, making sure not only that they have health care available. We are constructing new veterans health centers throughout the Commonwealth to make up for some of the abysmal treatment that they've received at the federal level, but also making sure that they have employment available, that they receive all the help they need to when they return from serving their country, and helping keep us safe to make sure that they can have a productive life as well.
Two new veterans service centers, one in Hampton Roads and one in Northern Virginia in the budget, correct?
There are, and Delegate, again, Cox has been a leader on that, and we're grateful to him and the folks that have supported that and the administration, and we're moving forward. And as Ben said, they're there to try to provide services that unfortunately they're falling through the cracks at the federal level.
And very briefly, the ability of veterans to translate their experience in the theater of war into certificates through our junior colleges.
Yeah, that's very important with the community college system, and getting them be able to use that experience that they got from the military experience and be able to translate that into the workforce, and to also provide information to employers so that they know what those skills are and how that can be translated.
Great. Thank you for being here, Delegate Ben Cline, Delegate Steve Landis. Good luck.
Thanks, Woody.
Thank you for watching Cable Reports, brought to you by the Virginia Cable Telecommunications Association and Comcast. Until next time, I'm Woody Evans. Mm-hmm.